spent the whole reunion calling me a disappointment in front of everyone and bragging about her perfect kids. Then, my little cousin flipped to the TV and the whole room saw me on the news. Every year, my mom's side of the family does a big reunion at my grandmother's house. It's always loud, always too much food, and someone always drinks too much and starts crying about something that happened in 1997. I actually love it. The only problem is my Aunt Connie. She has 2 children, my cousins Danny and Brittany, and according to her, they are the most accomplished, most talented, most everything people to ever walk the earth. Danny is a real estate agent, and Brittany works at a bank. That's fine. But Aunt Connie acts like they cured cancer and discovered a new planet on the same afternoon. And every single reunion, she picks me apart to make them look better. This year was the worst one. I got there early to help my grandmother set up and was carrying folding chairs from the garage when Aunt Connie pulled up. She didn't say hi. She looked at my car in the driveway and said, "Oh, you're still driving that?" I told her it runs fine. She said Danny just got himself a brand new SUV. I kept carrying chairs. She followed me inside and told my grandmother she should let Brittany handle the table setting since she had an eye for things like that. My grandmother said I was doing fine. Then Connie tasted the potato salad I'd made a face, and said Brittany uses a different recipe and she'd send it over. My grandmother told her it was her own recipe that she'd taught me. Connie said, "Well, maybe it just tastes different when she makes it." When people started showing up, she worked the room with updates on Danny's closings and Brittany's promotion, then looked right at me and asked what I'd been up to. I said work's been keeping me busy. She said, "Busy doing what exactly?" And when I didn't give her a detailed answer, she turned to my mom and said, "You know, some kids just take longer to figure things out. Not everyone can be like Danny and Brittany." My mom told her I was doing just fine. Connie patted her arm and said, "Of course you'd say that. You're her mother." At dinner, it got worse. We were all sitting at the long table in the backyard, and Connie was across from me. She asked if I was seeing anyone. When I said no, she told me Brittany's boyfriend is a financial advisor, and Danny's wife is in pharmaceutical sales. Then said, "You know what your problem is? You don't put yourself out there. You just hide." Danny looked uncomfortable and told her to knock it off. She said she was just being honest because nobody else in the family would say it. She asked how much I was making, right there at the dinner table. And when I said that wasn't really dinner conversation, she pivoted to announcing that Danny just bought a second property as an investment. Then she turned to my grandmother and said she prays for me at night because she doesn't want me to end up alone with nothing to show for myself. My grandmother told her that was enough. Connie said, "I'm the only one who cares enough to say something." After dinner, we all moved inside and she kept going. She told my other aunt that she'd once offered to help me with my resume, and I never took her up on it. That never happened. She told my uncle she'd thought about setting me up with someone from Danny's office but didn't want to embarrass me. She was talking about me like I wasn't 6 feet away from her. My youngest cousin Terrence got bored and grabbed the remote. He started flipping through channels and landed on a local network running a segment from earlier that week. It was a health and wellness panel. 4 people sitting at a table discussing treatment options for autoimmune conditions. I was one of them. The banner at the bottom of the screen had my full name, and underneath it said, "Doctor," with my specialty listed right after. Aunt Connie was mid-sentence telling someone I should really consider going back to school when Terrence said, "Wait, is that you?" The whole room went quiet. Every person at that reunion was staring at the TV screen, then back at me, then back at the screen. Terrence grabbed the remote and turned the volume up. My own voice filled the living room, clear and steady, talking about treatment approaches for autoimmune conditions, explaining how early intervention changes outcomes, and why patients need to advocate for themselves with their doctors. The room was frozen. Nobody moved, nobody chewed, nobody reached for a drink. They were all watching me on that screen, sitting at a table with 3 other doctors, holding my own in a conversation about medicine like it was the most normal thing in the world. Monica leaned toward my mom and whispered, "Doctor? Since when?" My mom didn't even look away from the screen. She just said quietly, "Since 4 years ago." My grandmother Andromache put her hand over her mouth and her eyes got wet. Uncle Dave leaned so far forward in his chair I thought he might fall out of it. The truth is, I never hid my career on purpose. I just stopped offering up information. Years ago, when I first got into medical school, I mentioned it at a reunion and Connie said, "Well, getting in is the easy part. Let's see if she finishes." When I started residency, I didn't bring it up. When I finished, I didn't bring it up. When I started practicing, I didn't bring it up. Because every single time I shared something about my life, Connie found a way to shrink it or compare it to something Danny or Brittany did. So I stopped feeding her. I became a doctor during the exact years she was loudly telling everyone I was lost, directionless, and needed prayer. I passed my boards while she was saying I needed direction. I completed my residency while she was offering to fix my resume. I started treating patients while she was worrying about me out loud at family dinners, performing concern for a room full of people who had no idea what I was actually doing with my days. I was working 30-hour shifts in a hospital while she was telling my family I couldn't figure out my life. I never corrected her because I didn't think I owed her an explanation. She never asked me a real question with any real interest. She only asked so she could set up her next comparison. So I let her talk, and I kept working. My grandmother was the one who broke the silence. She looked at the TV, then looked at me, and her voice cracked when she said, "That's my grandbaby. That's my grandbaby on that screen." She pressed both hands against her chest and shook her head like she couldn't believe it. Uncle Dave actually got to his feet and looked at me with an expression that was half proud and half confused. He said, "Hold on, you're a doctor? Like a real doctor? And you've been sitting here letting Connie talk to you like that all day?" The whole room felt different. People were looking at me the way I had always wanted to be looked at by this family. Not with pity, not with concern, just with pride. And then Connie laughed. Not a nervous laugh, the same loud, sharp laugh she uses when she wants to make something small. She waved her hand at the TV like she was swatting a fly and said, "Oh please, that's probably one of those little panel things anyone can get on. Brittany was on a podcast last month. It's not that serious." The warmth in that room disappeared so fast it was like someone opened a window in the middle of winter. Everyone looked at Connie, then at me, then back at Connie. That's when Danny walked back in through the side door. He came in fast, looked at the TV, looked at the room, and then looked at his mother. His face went tight. He said, "Mom, stop." Connie didn't even turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on the room and said, "I'm just saying, let's not act like being on local TV makes you a brain surgeon." Nobody nodded. Nobody smiled back. I stood there in the middle of all of it and something became very clear. This was the pattern. It didn't matter what the evidence was. She would compare a medical panel channel to a podcast. She would say whatever she had to say to keep her story alive, the story where her children were the best and I was the one everyone should worry about, and she was never going to stop on her own. I had spent years letting it go at these gatherings, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight, and the only thing that got me was a room full of relatives who thought I was lost. If I wanted this to end, I had to be the one to end it. So I took a breath, turned to face her directly, and said, "Aunt Connie, what exactly do you think I do for work?" The question landed in the room like a brick on a glass table. Connie blinked. For the first time all day, she didn't have an answer ready. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Finally, she said, "Well, you said you were busy. You never said doing what." She tried to say it like it was my fault. I kept my voice calm. "You never asked," I said. "You told me what you assumed." She opened her mouth again, but I kept going, steady and clear, and I laid it out for my family. I told them I went to medical school. I got through it. I did my residency. Years of training in a hospital where you barely sleep and learn your specialty by doing it over and over until you get it right. I finished, and I have been practicing medicine for 4 years now. 4 years. Then I said the part I think hit the hardest. I looked around the room and said, I didn't bring it up because every time I've ever shared anything at these reunions, it got compared, picked apart, or dismissed. So I stopped sharing. Nobody said a word for a few seconds. I could see people rewinding the last 10 years of reunions in their heads. All the times Connie stood in this very house talking about how worried she was about me, replaying all of it now with new information. Uncle Dave turned his whole body toward Connie. He said, "Connie, you've been saying this girl is lost for years. You've been saying it at every single reunion, and she was becoming a doctor the whole time." He said it slow, like he needed to hear himself say it to believe it was real. Connie could feel the room shifting. I watched her feel it. Her chin went up the way it always does when she's about to switch gears. When she can't dismiss something, she doesn't apologize. She finds a way to make herself the victim. Her voice changed, got softer, almost shaky. She put her hand on her chest and said, "Well, nobody told me. How was I supposed to know? If she had told me, I would have been her biggest supporter." She said it to the room, not to me. She wanted everyone to feel bad for her, to think the real problem was that I kept a secret, not that she spent years tearing me down. That's when my mom stood up. Madeline had been sitting by the window, watching everything, holding it all in the way she always does. But something about what Connie just said broke through whatever wall she had built up. She stood and her voice was steady, but there was a shake underneath it. She looked right at Connie and said, "Connie, she doesn't owe you a progress report, and you weren't trying to support her today. You were tearing her apart." My mom and Connie stood about 6 feet apart, and you could feel the history between them filling up the space like smoke. Connie's face changed. The victim act disappeared in half a second. Her cheeks went red and her jaw got tight, and she said, "Madeline, don't start with me. You've always let that girl do whatever she wants with no accountability. That's why I step in." There it was. She said, "That's why I step in," like she had some kind of job to do. Like criticizing me was a responsibility she had taken on because my own mother wasn't doing it right. I stood there watching them face each other, and I felt something I didn't expect. I wasn't angry anymore. I was sad, because I finally understood that Connie wasn't going to stop until she worked out whatever she had with my mom. Every dig she had ever thrown at me was really aimed at Madeline. Every time she said I was lost or lazy or needed direction, what she was really saying was that Madeline's daughter wasn't as good as hers, that Madeline wasn't as good a mother, that Madeline didn't win, and I was just the scoreboard. Connie wasn't done though. She turned away from my mom, turned away from me, and looked straight at Andromache. She walked over to where my grandmother was sitting in her big chair by the window and stood in front of her like a kid in front of a principal. Her voice came out different, higher, almost pleading. She said, "Mama, tell them I'm not the bad guy here. I've always looked out for this family. I've always been the one who says what needs to be said." The room was so quiet I could hear the TV still playing behind us. My own voice was still coming through the speakers, still talking about medicine, while Connie begged her mother to tell everyone she was the good one. Andromache didn't answer right away. She sat in her chair and looked at Connie for a long time. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her face was calm, but there was something heavy behind her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and firm. She said, "Connie, sit down." The little noise left in the room stopped entirely. Andromache didn't raise her voice. She just looked at Connie and waited, and after a few seconds, Connie sat down on the edge of the couch like her legs decided for her. Andromache kept her eyes on Connie and said, "I have watched you do this at every reunion for years. Every single one. You come into my house, you eat my food, and you spend the whole day making one of my grandchildren feel small so yours can feel big. You think I don't see it?" She paused, and her voice got even steadier. "I see everything." She let that sit in the air for a moment. The whole room was still. Connie opened her mouth, but Andromache raised her hand, just one hand, palm out, and said, "I'm not finished." Connie closed her mouth. I had never seen anyone stop Connie mid-sentence in my entire life. Andromache kept going. She said, "That potato salad you made that face at today? I taught her that recipe." She came to my counter and said, "Grandma, teach me how you make it." And we stood there together for a whole afternoon, and I showed her every step. "You never asked me to teach your kids anything, Connie. You were too busy telling everyone how perfect they already were." The words landed on Connie like stones. I could see her shoulders pull in, just slightly, like she was trying to make herself smaller. Then Danny stood up from the couch. He looked at his mother with his jaw tight and his eyes red around the edges and said, "Mom, Grandma's right. You do this every year and it's embarrassing." He paused and swallowed hard. Not for her, for us. Brittany, who had been on her phone all day, had finally put it down. Quietly, almost in a whisper, she said, "Same. I've asked you to stop so many times." She didn't look at Connie when she said it. She was looking at her own hands in her lap, but the words carried across the room. 2 children. Both of the kids Connie had spent the entire day propping up like trophies. Both of them telling her in front of the whole family that they didn't want to be her trophies anymore. The room held its breath. Nobody moved to fill the silence because nobody knew what came next. Connie looked at Danny, then at Brittany, then back at Danny. The sharpness was gone. The performance was gone. The confident woman who had walked into this house hours ago and started picking me apart before she even said hello was gone. What was left was something raw, shock, like the ground she had been standing on her whole life just cracked right down the middle. For 1 second, I almost felt something like sympathy for her, but then she did the thing Connie always does. She pulled herself together, straightened her back, and turned to me. She looked me right in the face and said, "Fine, you're a doctor. Congratulations." She said it the way you'd say it to someone who won a raffle for a gift basket. Empty. Flat. Then she leaned forward and said, but don't sit there and pretend like my pushing didn't have something to do with it. I'm the one who held you to a standard. Every person in that room was looking at me. Andromache in her chair. My mom by the window with her hands still shaking. Danny standing in the middle of the room looking tired and sad. Brittany on the couch with her phone forgotten beside her. Uncle Dave by the doorway. Monica on the arm of the couch. Even Terrence still holding the remote. I stood up. Not fast, not dramatic. I just stood up the way you stand up when you've made a decision and you're not going back on it. I looked right at Connie and kept my voice at the same level I use when I'm talking to a patient who needs to understand something important. Calm, clear, no room for confusion. I said, Aunt Connie, you didn't push me. You pushed everyone in this room to believe I was nothing. And the only reason that didn't break me is because the people who actually love me never believed you. I looked at my mom by the window with her hands trembling at her sides, then at my grandmother sitting in her chair. Then I turned back to Connie. You didn't hold me to a standard. You held me under your foot so your kids would look taller. And you did it at every single reunion since I was 15 years old. Connie's mouth opened, loading up her next redirect, her next excuse. I kept going. Not fast, not loud, just steady. You told everyone I was lost when I was in medical school. You told everyone I was lazy when I was working 30-hour shifts in a hospital. You told people you offered to help me with my resume when that never happened. You said nobody else would say the hard things because you cared. But you didn't care about me, Aunt Connie. You cared about winning. She leaned forward to interrupt and I said, I'm not finished. 3 words. The exact same words my grandmother had used. And from her chair, Andromache nodded. It was a small nod, barely a movement, but I saw it, and Connie saw it, and the whole room saw it. I took one more breath and said the thing I think everyone in that room had been circling around all day without being able to put it into words. This was never about me and you know it. This is about you and my mom. You've been competing with her since you were kids, and when you couldn't beat her, you went after her daughter instead. My mom never said a bad word about your kids, not once. She celebrated Danny and Brittany at every single reunion, every house Danny sold, every promotion Brittany got. My mom smiled and said how proud she was of them. All she ever asked was that you do the same for me. I paused because I needed Connie to really hear the next part, and you couldn't. The silence after that was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. Connie sat there on that couch, and I watched something happen to her face that I had never seen before. It crumbled, slowly. Her chin started shaking first. Then her lips pressed together hard, like she was trying to physically hold the words in. Then her eyes got wet and red around the edges. She opened her mouth and her voice came out broken, cracked right down the middle. And she said, that's not, I didn't. And then nothing. She couldn't finish. She just sat there with her mouth slightly open and no words coming out, like a machine that finally ran out of whatever was powering it. For the first time in my entire life, my Aunt Connie had nothing to say. Danny stepped forward and put his hand on his mother's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't defend her or try to fix it. He just put his hand on her shoulder and stood there, like a son who loves his mother but knows she's wrong and doesn't know what else to do. Andromache broke the silence. She said, Connie, I love you, but you owe this girl an apology. A real one. Not today. Today you can't mean it, but you owe her one. Connie didn't look at her mother. She sat completely still for a few seconds, then reached down, grabbed her purse from the floor next to the couch, and stood up. Danny's hand slid off her shoulder as she rose. She didn't say a word. She walked past me, past my mom, past Uncle Dave, past Monica and Jillian and Terrence, through the living room with her purse clutched against her side and her back straight and her chin up. The kind of chin up that people do when they're trying not to fall apart in front of an audience. She got to the front door, pulled it open, and then she stopped. She stood in the door frame with the evening light coming in behind her and turned around. She looked at me. Just me. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Connie said quietly, almost in a whisper, I didn't know you were a doctor. And I said, I know. That's the whole point. She held my eyes for one more second. Then she turned around and walked out. The screen door swung shut behind her with that soft slapping sound that screen doors make. And then she was gone. Andromache patted the seat next to her chair and looked at me with those warm brown eyes and said, come sit with me, doctor. I walked over and sat down next to my grandmother and she took my hand in both of hers and held it. I didn't cry. I was too tired and too relieved and too full of something I couldn't name. I just sat there and felt, for the first time at a family reunion, like I didn't have to be small. Like I could take up my actual space. Like nobody in this room was going to try to shrink me down to make someone else look bigger. My mom came over a few minutes later and sat on the other side of me. She didn't say anything. She just reached over and squeezed my hand. One squeeze. Firm. Warm. Later that night, after I'd driven home and was sitting on my couch with the TV on but not really watching it, my phone buzzed. It was Danny. He said he was sorry. He said he was proud of me. He said he didn't know how to fix what his mom had done, but he wanted me to know he saw it and it wasn't okay. About an hour after that, Terrence sent me a message that said, so does being a doctor mean you can write me a note to skip school? I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes up from your belly and shakes your shoulders. I sat there on my couch thinking about Andromache calling me doctor, and my mom squeezing my hand and Connie's face when she walked out that door. The TV was still on in the background, and nobody was there to change it.